Well, welcome everyone for coming along. It's been kind of anticipated for a little while now, so it's really cool to have you all here. And I know everyone's in different time zones as well, so I appreciate those who are either up really early or really late. Um, but just to introduce myself, my name's Arran Baker, and I'm a senior animator at Jellyfish Pictures, working on our first feature film, which is really exciting. And today I wanted to cover a little bit about how I approach an acting shot in animation, because a lot of people um, kind of dive straight into it and don't really know, like including myself to begin with, like the different procedures you can use to help you get like a genuine performance. And there's a lot of different methods you can use that have been shared knowledge across time from lots of different professional animators, and I've kind of collaborated and condensed that into my own sort of checklist that I go through each time I approach a new shot. And so that's the first thing I wanted to cover today. And then from there, I'll go into a bit more about how I've executed that myself in actual shots, and I can show you a bit of breakdown, just some reference. I don't have any work in progress or like progressions of the shots themselves because I don't have the authorization to do that, but I can show you the final result and the very, very early stages. And I'll break down for you how I kind of tackled the shots themselves as well. I can break down the shots as well because I know you guys all like to see that, but that's not going to be my main focus of this talk. It's mostly going to be the initial approach before I even touch the scene. So the first thing, this is a checklist which you can get online. I open sourced it on my Twitter, so anyone can just access this. It's just a Google document. And this is kind of, like I mentioned before, like a condensed, I say condensed, it's very long, but this is pretty much everything that I try to think about and cover when I'm approaching a shot from the very beginning all the way to polish. And it's very difficult for me to, like, I try to remind myself to use this checklist every time, but sometimes I get too focused into a shot and I have to take a step back and look at it and say, okay, what's actually wrong with this? So the first thing that I do is, like, this can work not only for in a sequence. This usually you would use this scenario in if you had a sequence of shots or if you was part of a whole overarching story. But you should still be thinking about this even if you have one single shot. If you're just working on a personal shot, you need to think about what the overall art, like create a story yourself. Like, what is the main motivation of this character? Try and think about who they are as a person. What gives them their own personality, their own niches? Is there anything that they do with their face? All these little things. Like, look at their design. How heavy are they? How is that going to what are they wearing? All these sorts of things determine the different performances you'll get out of a character. So the first thing that I do, first and foremost, is where is my character at this moment, and what is the red dot of the scene. Now, what we mean by the red dot, it's a term that we use when we've been working on our most recent productions, both on How to Train a Dragon and our current project, where our director will say, you've got a series of shots. Now, throughout these series of shots, you've got one particular moment, which is the key point, and that everything should focus around that one point. So, for example, if you had someone who was going to whip out a gun and he was going to shoot somebody, you don't want to take away that climactic moment by overacting or doing something more beforehand. So if you had like a Western and you had this anticipation where they're about to draw their guns and then it's who's going to get shot first, you don't want the guy dancing around doing something crazy beforehand because it steals attention from the main moment. So sometimes doing nothing is actually better if it helps to build up that performance. So the red dot of the scene is quite important. So what I tend to do is, even if it's not my shot, for example, and there's a red dot in my sequence, but I'm not actually executing that red dot moment, I'll make sure that my shots are building up to that moment. So I'm thinking, what is the main purpose of this shot, both from the director's point of view, and everything needs to build around their intention, you know? Like, each shot has a purpose, so you've got to think about what's the purpose of that specific shot. And that's basically your one job. As long as you've got that right, then the story is going to work. If you're not hitting that, if you're not hitting the objective of that, or the purpose of that shot, then you haven't done your duty as an animator, because that is your main priority. So other things I'm thinking about, this is in sequence cases. If you're just working on one shot, it's still, you can still, I personally still think about this. So what are the hookups? So by this, I'm thinking about what happens in the shot before my shot and the shot after it. So that way, as the camera cuts, then it feels like a seamless transition. So even if it was a single shot and there wasn't any, you was literally just working on one shot by yourself, still think about where have they come from before this shot and where are they going afterwards. Because if you just start with everything static, sometimes that is the case, but if they was running in the shot before, you want to be entering the shot running. You don't want to be standing there and then go into the run. And sometimes that can help with the pacing of your shot. So it's good to think about where your character was before and after that shot. What is the context of the shot? So this is kind of what I mean by the purpose of the shot. So if the context was, for example, someone needs to park a car, then that is the context. The context could be they've just had a breakup with their girlfriend and they're parking their car in a parking lot because they can't concentrate. I've just made that up on the spot, but that's the context. And so you need to write that down and think about that is your main focus, is making sure that you're hitting that emotion. That is the context. Now, when it comes to your performance, a lot of people, what a lot of animators do, especially juniors or beginners, when they're first doing their first ever performance shots, is they animate to the context, which is okay. Sometimes it works, because sometimes the context is that deliberate, it is that literal, that the performance requires that. But in most cases, that's where you start to get more cliche like acting choices. Because if someone said, "Hey, you over there," if someone goes, "Hey, you," and points, that's like deliberate, intentional, like you're just animating to the context, and there's no like secondary internal emotional thought process. Like what you need to think about is, how is the character saying that line, and that's going to then determine how they do that action. So if there's a really good example of this, I first learned about subtext from a video by Sir Wade, which is on YouTube, and he did an interview with JP Sands, who was an animation supervisor at Dreamworks, and he talks about subtext, and essentially he uses the example of someone saying, "Hey, you, get out," and the way that character says that can completely change the performance. So if I said, "Hey, you, get out," or "Hey, you, get out," that like they're two completely different ways that they're saying that, and that changes the subtext. You could be upset, you could be happy, you could be down, you could be confused. All, you know, there's unlimited amounts of ways that they could tackle that kind of performance, and you've got to basically you need to come up with a subtext that is going to help you act and make that performance genuine. So I'll show you examples of that later. And I've actually written down my subtexts in my shots, and you can see how I've been thinking about how I approach the shot. So that's really important. So what I tend to do is I write down on a piece of paper the context of my shot, and then underneath I write the subtext. So if it was "Hey, you get out," then underneath I would write "Hey, you get out." That's the context, and underneath I would put "I don't want to be with you right now," and that's my subtext. And then when I shoot my reference, I'm filming to the subtext, not the context. So even though he says, "Hey, you get out," I'm not miming or acting to those words. I'm acting to, "I don't want to be with you right now." And then that is going to help make it feel more natural, and it just makes it feel more genuine and sincere. And it gives the shot a bit more clarity. So I think that's really important, and that's kind of what makes or breaks an acting performance. Is like, if you're not, you need to like feel what the character is feeling and how they say it, and that's what determines how they move. So that was the main focus that I wanted to do from this talk, is subtext, and I will show you some examples of that later. So then I go on to thinking about who is the character, what is their overarching development, and where are they in that situation. So, for example, I'll show you some shots later where we know who Hiccup is from How to Train Your Dragon. That was one of the benefits of working on a sequel. There's a short film that we worked on, that the characters were already established, but the difference is they were older. So the only difference that we had to consider is where the characters were in How to Train Your Dragon 3, and then say 20 years later, or maybe 10 years later, because they're about 30 in our short film. So how have they changed in that time? They're now parents. So, and they're married. Like Hiccup and Astrid are married now. So that's going to potentially change their dynamic. And so, but other than that, they were very well established characters. So I knew who they were. And the main overarching development is like the main arc of their story inside the whole thing. So, spoilers for who hasn't seen the short film, but it's only a 20-minute short film. It's nothing crazy break. But essentially, our short film takes place between when How to Train Your Dragon 3 practically ends, and then the very last sequence, which is when they're older and they have the children. So ours happens between then, and there's a little bit of discontinuity, but it works as its own short film, which was the main priority. And so essentially in that arc, Hiccup has said goodbye to Toothless, and he misses him. Like, they both miss each other, but they know that their worlds need to be separated. And because time has gone by, people don't know about like children, and the children of New Burke now don't know what dragons are. They think they're dangerous, whereas the adults know that they're not dangerous and they used to live with them, and so they try and create this story so that they can teach the children that dragons are okay. The plot twist is Toothless also misses them, and he comes to visit the humans. And so a lot of the overarch with Hiccup is he's concerned that his children still see things as they were at the very beginning of the first Dragons film, where Vikings just wanted to kill dragons because they thought they were dangerous and they were going to mark their territory. And he wanted to teach them that actually, no, they're our friends. So that was the main arc of the story. How do they move? What's in their personalities? How do they gesture? Are they quite timid? Are they very confident? Like, their overall like body gestures, you got to think about those things. How heavy are they? So this is what I was saying before. Are they quite broad? Are they very short? Are they quite light? Because that's going to determine the spacing and the weight of the character. And you should be thinking about that when you're filming a reference, which I'll also show you later. There's some quite funny reference of me trying to act either lighter than I am or heavier than I am. And I use different methods to help with that. This is when it comes more to posing, but I'm thinking about what are the shapes in the design of my character. So if I try to simplify, say, stoic, when he's really broad and he's quite butch and he's quite square, compared to, say, I'm trying to think who's rounder. What's his name? Well, if you've seen Klaus, for example, you've got Klaus himself, who's very square and he's very broad, and then you've got Jasper, who's very thin and he's got these like triangular shapes to him. So when I'm posing my character, I'm trying to graphically stay consistent with those shapes, and then finding the appeal in the character. So finding different shapes that kind of communicate the personality of that character and give it a charm. And then what are the relationships with other characters? I've put over characters typo there. But yeah, so I'm thinking about how does my character respond differently with other characters in the story, and how they respond to one person is going to be different to another different person. So I'm thinking about things there. Common traits they have. So if a character tended to like scratch his ear, for example, then maybe that's something that I could potentially implement if the moment asks for it. Maybe they blink a certain way. Maybe in our case, Hiccup tends to gesture a lot with his shoulders and he's quite bouncy. And so we didn't want to oversaturate it with those kind of actions, but if the moment required it, then maybe that's something we could think about. I'll go a little more into gestures with Hiccup later because there's some interesting stories that we were told there. And then like iconic body gestures and mechanics. So those are the main things I'm thinking about before I've started my shot. Then I'm inside the shot. I'm thinking about what are the beats. So I'm thinking about the rhythm of the shot. So you could have a completely different timing. Like each shot has a different rhythm, and so I'm thinking about where I can use my beats to like change the performance. So, like we said before, if someone said, "Hey, you, get out," there's a 1, 2, 3, 4. It's not 1, 2, 3, 4. There's a beat in between. And so in that beat, you could potentially add an accent somewhere. Maybe it could be a gesture or an eye dart or a change in expression on the face. So it could be, if I just went like, "Hey, you, get out." Like there's a little like beat of internal process in there. And so I'm thinking about where I can add in, where I'm thinking about the beats in my shot and where I can add them. Are they holding anything? So are there any props in the scene? Is there anything they can interact with? If there's a chair beside them, maybe they touch the chair. Like one thing that tends to elevate a shot generally is if they interact with their environment, because it makes them feel more immersed and engrossed, and therefore the audience feels that same way. So if you've got all these props around you, but they're literally like sticking to themselves and not touching anything, sometimes it feels a little less natural. Whereas if they're like leaning on the wall, or if there's like a pencil and they start fiddling with it, all these little things, like every single character is going to touch and move something a different way. And so that's a new challenge and a new thing for you to figure out. And it makes your shot overall more interesting and appealing. Where are they looking? So essentially eye lines, if they have different directions or anything like that. Feel free to ask questions in the chat, guys. and then I think Eddie will be checking it out. So I'll be happy to answer anything you guys are thinking about.
Yeah, or jump on webcam if you want to ask Arran personally.
Sure. Yeah, go for it.
Feel free to do that as well. But yeah, go ahead, Arran. There's no questions so far.
Okay, fair enough. I'll take that as a good thing. So I've put a tip to myself here: film someone else for acting if needed, which I tend to use a lot, and you'll see in my reference for the dragon stuff is like sometimes it's very hard to get into character. Like I'm actually struggling that with the current shots I'm doing. And so sometimes it's better to find someone who's just more natural, like who feels more in touch with that character. So for example, I struggled to act as Astrid, and there was another animator who we worked with, Catherine Heller, who she's amazing when it comes to acting reference. She just does it so naturally, and she became our allocated actor for reference when it came to Astrid. And so she came up and she would give suggestions with acting performances and that kind of thing. If you've got, I don't know, some really like muscular guy and you're quite a timid, shy person who's quite small, maybe it's best that you can still film it yourself, but it's also good to ask someone who may be just more natural to perform in that certain way. And they may come up with something that you didn't think of. Even if your performance still might work better, and then therefore you just go with your own performance. But just the way someone moves is going to be different. Like you can't make yourself heavier or lighter, like physically, unless you do something extra on top of your body. So sometimes just to get weight, it's good to at least get some reference of someone else who's slightly more in proportion with your character. These are just tips that I gave to myself. So when I'm filming reference, act to the subtext, not the dialogue, which is what I said before. So this was an interesting one, which I'll go a bit more into later. But where are they in your scene? So are they in a forest? Are they under a waterfall? Are they in a desert, or are they in an igloo in the North Pole? Like those different things are going to change the way your character performs on top of their own personality. If it's freezing cold, they'll probably be quite close to themselves and quite stiff. Whereas if it's a desert, then they're going to be quite loose and they're going to be exhausted. And so those are different like things that you can add on top of your body gestures that are going to make your character feel more immersed. Because if you're in a desert and they're just walking around like la 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 la, just doing the normal thing, then it doesn't feel like they're there, and it takes your like disbelief away from the scene, which is the last thing you want to do. If it's raining outside and it's freezing cold, think about how they would be moving in that way. I actually I'll show you an example later of a practice test I just did by myself, where I had a character outside and it was supposed to be at night. So I actually waited till it was nighttime and I sat down in my back garden to film my reference. That way my body language just felt more natural to the environment it was sitting in. And I didn't have to consciously think about, okay, I need to be cold right now. I could just act naturally and I didn't have to think about it, because that's just how I would have moved at nighttime. But I'll show you a funny example of that later. What are they wearing and how may that change their performance? If they're wearing like cloth, then maybe they'll just be able to act quite flexible. But if they were wearing lots of heavy armor, or I don't know, if they had a helmet on, that's going to change the restrictions on their body. If they had like a massive harness on or something, they might feel a little more restrictive. And again, that counts for like props as well. So for example, which you'll see later, Gobber has a prosthetic arm and a prosthetic leg. And so a lot of the animators, when they film their reference, would actually pretend to have a peg leg. Or in my case, I held a book in my hand. That way my hand felt like a big wooden plank, and I tried to keep my wrist stiff. That way it felt like a prosthetic arm. Rather than if I was just to act and have like a flexible hand, then it wouldn't feel like it was in character. And then I said before, what were they doing before the shot?
So on that note,
Yeah.
How do you practice, or do you practice much before getting the right mood that you want to portray? So
I generally have something in mind. Like mostly I'm looking at the tone of the scene, and I do kind of try different things to see what feels right, but a lot of the time I go with my gut. There has been a few times, including recently, where I've really struggled with a performance to just either get in character or feel like I'm hitting the tone right, because sometimes it's very specific, and it's hard if you can't feel that character, especially if they haven't been established yet. So it has its challenges sometimes, but a lot of the time I kind of just go with my gut and try. Like I tend to do like the tone tends to kind of stay the same when I film my reference, so I don't tend to vary it up enough, which I actually consider that a bad thing personally. Like I mentioned earlier with Catherine, when she provides reference for me, she'll do lots of different scenarios and different tones, and that will help you find the right balance of what you're looking for. And I think that's something that's really good. So it's good to have like a range of like different emotions and tones when you're filming reference. And that will help you settle on like precisely what you're looking for. But with me, naturally, I kind of go to one idea and I try to finesse it. And for the most part, directors are usually happy with the performance. It's just how I saw it. I had a vision for it, but it doesn't always work. So I would suggest trying different things and see what comes most naturally to you. And when you watch it back, you'll know what feels right. Like just go with your gut.
So when it comes to like the clients, and
Yeah,
they've probably got a performance in mind.
yeah.
The question is,
Sometimes.
how do you find ownership and creativity over a shot with a board artist and voiceover actor have kind of done all the decision making?
Yeah, for sure. I think when it comes to that kind of thing, I mean, with the clients that I've worked with so far, I've been very grateful because a lot of the time they're quite flexible. Like with most of the clients I've worked for, they tend to be, as long as you're striking the right tone and you're hitting the moment and the purpose of the shot, then they're quite open to see how you perform it. But if something feels wrong to them, they will tell me. But for the most part, they're usually quite flexible and they trust us as animators to kind of get the right performance, and they want us to have our own ownership of it as well. So I think I've been very lucky in that sense, but I know that there are directors out there and clients who will be very strict and they want it a very specific way. And if that is the case, then I would still film reference, but just try and hit the points that they're addressing and then go from there.
So do you completely depend on your reference without changes, or the shot evolves, becomes much different than the first reference? Sorry, that's the question.
Okay, sure. It varies. I think it also depends on the style of the show. So with things that tend to be more cartoony, I tend to rely more on my drawings and my thumbnails because I'm pushing things a lot more beyond reality, even though I'm still basing it on reality. So I'll still look at my character and think, how would they move in real life if they exist? That is, I've worked on characters that wouldn't exist in real life, as we've seen before with Happy and that kind of thing, which was more cartoony. So that kind of thing, I relied more on my drawings. Even though it would still film reference, it was more for details like how the eyes would dart and maybe a specific head turn or that kind of thing. But if it's something like How to Train Your Dragon, like it's on the borderline between realism and caricature. That's literally, they refer to the style as caricatured realism at Dreamworks. And so they're very adamant that you have it on like your weight is correct and that the mechanics still feel very natural, even though it still has to feel like, you don't want it to feel so realistic that it feels uncanny. Like there's a borderline where you're still hitting poses, but on top of that you want it to feel very natural. And so with things like dragons, when I filmed reference, I did tend to stick closer to it, as you'll see. I would still change the spacing, the timing, so that it felt like it suited the character and it felt more concise, and and everything read a little better. And I'd still push the poses and that kind of thing. But for the most part, like I would try and get my beats, and I wouldn't really be thinking too much about posing in my reference, but I would use that as inspiration to pose my character when I actually go into a scene. So I think a lot of it depends on the style.
I'll give you a few more questions then.
Go for it.
Unless you want to go ahead with your presentation.
I think for the most part now, in terms of my checklist, it's going more on like the actual animating process, which I'll go a bit more into the actual examples rather than just going through this checklist. But I would advise everyone to check it out because there's a lot of good tips in there.
For sure, yeah. I think someone posted a link as well to that.
Oh, sweet. Thank you to whoever did that. I can't take credit for the whole checklist because there was a lot of things that I got from other people, like different suggestions, and there was actually a different checklist. I can't remember who made it now. Very, very famous animator. Sorry, I can't remember their name at this very moment. But I took a lot of their tips and then added it. So it's a big collage of different people's things as well as my own. I'd say the majority of it is mine, but there's still a lot of people's input into this.
I'll read you one more.
Go for it.
So would you edit different takes together of your reference or import several clips together into Maya and blend between? That's something I do and I tell my students to do.
Yeah.
Is that something you do?
Yes. So what I tend to do is I'll film tons of takes and then I'll play them all back, pick a handful which I think are working best. Mm-hmm. Or if there's like a specific moment in one of the clips, I'll still take that whole clip and then I'll chuck it into Premiere and I'll cut different segments out and make a big like collage of it to hit the right moments. And then I'll blend between in and out of those. And then from that, I export that, chuck that into Maya, and that's what I use as my reference. But I do edit my reference quite a lot. As you'll see, there's one particular shot in the examples I'll show you later where it's a massive collage. Like I think there was about 30 minutes worth of reference. And it was a 16-second shot with two characters, but both characters have different cut segments at different times. So it was quite an edit. It took a while, but yeah, you'll see that's quite crazy. Cool. I'll just keep going, I guess. So yeah, this is just, there's some good tips in this checklist, so I would highly recommend. I can backtrack into this a little bit later if we need to, when I go a bit more into my workflow, but for now, I'll just actually dive onto some cool shots so you can actually see something. So the first thing that I'll show you is the process of some of my shots on dragons, and then I'll break them down later. So the first one I've got is a scene halfway through. First I'll show you the shot and then I'll break it down. So this is this shot here. So this is two shots that had to hook up as well. So this was about midway through the production, I think. Hopefully you guys will be able to hear it. Cool. So that was the two shots in that sequence I had. And this was my planning for it. So this is my first briefing, like my context that I would write down first. Hiccup is looking over his project, discussing his goals. Hiccup wants his kids to see how great Toothless is. He clearly misses Toothless. This is also his way of feeling closer to him by doing this project. Gobber admires his intentions, but consoles in Hiccup that there's nothing that can truly replace your best friend. So that's the context of the shot. And then I would write down the dialogue, and then I'd break it down into subtext. So the first thing Hiccup says is, I'm going to make him look so much like Toothless. And underneath I've put, they will see how great he is. I know him so well. So there are two different kind of subtexts there, but I kind of use both of those two sentences to kind of think about my performance. And so when he says, I know him so well, you'll see that in the performance where he acts a little bit confident. He's a little like, I know him better than everyone. But he does it in a way that feels natural to Hiccup, because Hiccup isn't a particularly confident character overall. So you don't want him to come across too smug or too in your face. But he does it in like a kind of geeky, awkward kind of way. And then in the next line he says is, Zephyr's going to fall in love with him. Zephyr's his daughter, just for context. And then underneath I've put, my daughter will fall in love with him as much as I do. And they're very similar, but the difference is when he says Zephyr's going to fall in love with him, he's trying to share a bond with his daughter. So I try to make it a bit more about, like, he wants his daughter to love to love Toothless as much as he does. And so when he says that line, I try to make him act as though he was kind of in awe about he's like reminiscing over good times with Toothless as he's saying it. So like Zephyr's going to fall in love with him. It's not like he's thinking about all the great times that Toothless is going to have or like would have with his daughter. And then I put underneath there's a beat. And then underneath that I've put, we had so many great times. And so that's again kind of like the reminiscing side. So even though there's a pause where he doesn't say anything, he's still internally thinking about all the great times he had. Because there's a very long pause where Hiccup's not saying anything, like about 6 or 7 seconds. And so what would he be doing in that time? So I was thinking he's probably going to be looking at his projects thinking, oh, not that I miss him, but we had an amazing life together.
Hey, sorry, Aaron, just continue on. I'm just going to jump away for a couple of minutes, but
no worries.
Karen, I'll be right back.
Sweet. And then Gobber says he's beautiful. But the way he says it, he's like, he's beautiful. And I wanted to get the impression that like he's both supporting Hiccup, but he's also like, only you could have made him this well. Like no one else could have made this robot toothless mannequin that he's made. Like no one could have done it better. So it's a slightly different change. It just helps support the tone of the way he says it. And then there's a beat. So there'll be like in this beat, there's like an internal like thought process from Gobber. And he says, I can see you miss him. So that in that beat, he's internally thinking like, I can see you miss him, but, and then he says, but cogs and gears can't bring back. And then the subtext is, I know you miss him, but you can't replace him. And so the way in his expression, I wanted to get the idea that he's being sympathetic towards him, and he does understand that he's excited to see him, but he does also need to realize that you can't replace him with this project that you're doing. Like nothing's more special than your best friend. And then the last thing that Gobber says is the warmth of your best friend's nose or the light in his eyes. And the overarching story for Gobber in this short film is he misses his best friend Stoic, who, spoiler alert, I mean, it's like 6 or 7 years ago, this film, but Stoic died in the second movie, who was Gobber's best friend. And so when he says the warmth of your friend's nose or the light in his eyes, even though he's talking to Hiccup about Toothless, he's actually personally now reminiscing about his own friendship with Stoic. And so he's not looking at Hiccup in this moment, he's also in his own like reminiscence. So it's a very like family, like supportive kind of tone. Yeah. So the red dot of the scene, it said in my launch here, is like we're coming from a very sentimental place. This is what my director was saying. I'm just seeing. Like this, he said the scene has to be very honest, and it's all about missing your loved ones. Like those are the main key tone points that he wanted me to hit. Like the key word is family, is what he said, and so I wanted to make sure I was hitting those points. So this is my reference for this shot. So I did have reference for Gobber, but I filmed someone else at a different time and I didn't grab the footage of that. But this is my reference for Hiccup. And you can see that I shot from 2 different angles because there's a cut. And so thankfully I had 2 cameras on me, which is also really useful. It's a good tip to have if you have more cameras to use different angles. It's always a bonus. You don't have to, but it helps. So I've got one of the mid shot, which is the second shot here. And then we got the first shot on the right. So you can see in my reference that I was trying to swing my arms because like Hiccup is quite loose in his body, like in his body gestures. He tends to kind of like throw his weight, but in like a floppy way, like almost like he's quite not limp, but he's not a strong, like stern character. He kind of he's a bit like, I guess you could say somewhat insecure.
Is that
and so
did you do a lot of research in the first 3 then to kind of deduct that personality as well? And that
definitely. So we actually had the first 2 movies because I think the third one had only just been released, so DreamWorks didn't give us the 3rd movie, unfortunately, which is really frustrating. But we did have the first 2 movies that we could use as reference, so it's kind of studying the body performances there. Mm-hmm. But we did, as I said, like they're at a very different point in their lives now, and there's a very different, like not tone, but the characters have developed in that time, especially since the first one. So we didn't tend to look at the first one so much. There's a couple of clips that DreamWorks provided us from the 3rd movie, which were like the kind of both the quality bar, but also the kind of performances that they wanted to see us try and hit with the characters, which was really good for reference, especially with Hiccup, because he was one of the hardest to get right.
So Oz was asking, when you are shooting reference based on subtext rather than dialogue, how do you manage to stick to the actor's performance and timing, or doesn't it?
No, it definitely does matter, and that's the struggly. Like that's one of the harder parts to make sure you're still getting right. So this is where I say, like, what are the beats? So sometimes it's handy to try and make a subtext that has a similar rhythm and beat to the original dialogue. Or what you could always try to do is film yourself first without subtext. Film yourself to the subtext. See what kind of performances you come up with naturally. Forget about what they actually say. And then once you've hit that tone, you're like, okay, this is the kind of performance I would want to get. Then try and reenact that, but trying to hit the beats that are in the actual dialogue. So it's like a two-step process, but it does help. Like I say, sometimes the shot is so literal. Like if what they're saying is so direct and intentional, then you can just animate to the context because there's no second layer to their emotion. But a lot of the time, in most cases, there's usually an underlying thought process in someone's mind when they say something, and so it's good to at least try to act to the subtext first. That way, you're not like at least at first you're not hitting too many like cliche or too literal like body movements and acting choices. So it's good to experiment, honestly. That's what I would say. But do keep in mind the actual beats of your shots dialogue, because that is really important. So don't forget about that. But I do understand your question, because it's difficult sometimes to try and act to subtext and then you feel like you're missing the beats. So you've got to be careful, but it's more just a mindset. I think that's the way I try and think about it, is when I act to my subtext, I'm more thinking about how I would be acting under those lines, even though I'm hitting a different beat and rhythm, if that makes sense. It's difficult, but with practice, you kind of get used to it.
Also, I've done some screenwriting courses.
Oh yeah.
And usually when writers are creating scenes and scenarios, they're usually writing subtext into the scene as well,
right,
to add layer to the, to what's going on, to make it more interesting as well. And that also applies to animation. So
yeah, definitely.
They're thinking and feeling something else to what is happening on the outside.
Yeah, exactly. Because you've got to kind of convey an emotion on top of what's literally happening. Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't really thought about it that way. I kind of just I read the script and just, I guess I do take it quite literally until I create my own subtext, but of course they've gone through that process themselves already. So you kind of got to almost understand the subtext that they've written as well, which is why it's good to communicate with the directors, because obviously they've had their own kind of idea of subtext with the script as well. So it's good to make sure you're on the same page.
Yeah, it just creates more rounded and more complex personalities and characters, and also
Definitely.
behaviors.
Yeah.
Rather than, like you said, rather than literal on surface.
Yeah, it makes them a little more dimensional, doesn't it?
Exactly. Yeah.
Cool. So my next shot that I've got for you is this is my biggest challenge and the hardest shot that I had, both in performance-wise and in animating. So I think this was nearly a 20-second shot, and it was of Astrid and Hiccup. And essentially, this was at a point in the story where it was quite early on, so before the scene that we saw before they've come up with the idea to make this stage play that's going to reenact Hiccup and Toothless's story. And this is where they first come up with the idea. And so for a bit of context, what happens before is they had this idea of a pageant or a stage play where it was called, I believe it's called Snuggletog or something like this. I can't remember specifically, but essentially they used to do these plays when Hiccup was younger, and it would reenact stories, and they thought that would be a good way to communicate to the children that dragons are friendly. But when they look back on these old stage plays that Gobber wrote when Hiccup was a child, they're very violent, and it was a very traumatic event for Hiccup. And so he looks through this book and he's absolutely terrified. And so they basically, in this shot, this was like the turning point of the story where Hiccup is terrified by this traumatic event, and Astrid comes up with a solution to say, how about we tell the story of when you met Toothless and then up to now, so that they understand. And then Hiccup has to have this change in emotion where he's super excited and he gets like really enthusiastic, and he's just, there's so many like dials going around in his head that he can't say all the words as fast as he wants to. Like his brain's going at 100 mile an hour and he's struggling to keep up. So it had to feel quite frantic and over enthusiastic. And then Astrid tries to calm him down. And then they come up with a solution together. That's essentially the context of the shot. And the struggle for me was trying to figure out, because it hadn't been established, what Astrid and Hiccup's relationship would be like after marriage and children. And that was something that they didn't necessarily give me in the brief, but I knew it just needed to feel that way to be a genuine performance, because I was just thinking about the overall context of the whole short film. And so I just wanted to make sure I was hitting that tone right. So when I was writing my subtext and my acting choices, I was trying to think about those things that would feel natural for them through marriage and kids. So the first thing the Hiccup says is, "This has not aged well," and he's looking at the book and he's freaking out. And so the subtext is, "Let's not go back to these times." And then Astrid says, "We may need to start from scratch." And the way she says it is like, it's okay, we don't need to go back down that path again. And then she has like a beat where she's internalizing, she's thinking about what they could do. And then Astrid says, "Why don't we show when everything changed?" And the subtext here is, "This is a much more optimistic story. I already know this is a good idea." So she's quite like enthusiastic, and she's just like, "Yeah, this is such a good idea. Like, we could do this instead." And so the way she says that is going to determine her performance. Then Hiccup says, "Oh, that would be fantastic." And the way he says it is super enthusiastic. Like, he's just gone from scared to thought process to listening to her to then be like, "Oh my God, yes." And so there has to be this just like, it can't just be a complete switch from I'm sad, now I'm happy. It needs to be like, there needs to be a build up in his mind. And so as he's listening to her, I was trying to get this idea that he's just like, yeah, kind of thing. There's a slow build up where it's gone from like, there needs to be like a neutral tone in between so that it feels like it builds up and it has a transition. And so in the subtext here, it said, "Yes, you've got it. I have so many ideas." And then I put a note to myself in brackets, "Woody shot Critters Dynamite," in brackets, from Toy Story 2, because there was a bit of reference in there where Woody gets super enthusiastic and he starts throwing his gestures around. And I thought that might be good to help me with the tone. So I also look online at different reference if there's anything both animated and in real life. Mostly it's real life stuff that I look at for helping with reference, but sometimes just to help convey an emotion or a tone, there's some animated stuff that's good just to get an essence for, but I wouldn't copy it or anything along those lines. I want to make my own kind of performance. And then Hiccup says, "Like when I met Toothless." And there's a part, I put a part 1 and a part 2 here. So in part 1, it says, "Quick, I've got to think of an idea," and he clicks his fingers. And I just had this idea where he's just like, oh, and he's just like clicking, and he's just like, there's so many things going on in my brain right now, because he's super enthusiastic. So adding these little clicks, just thought it'd be quite fun, and it'd add like a nice secondary action to make him, to like support how excited he was. It is really cool because that wasn't in the boards, and they were directed all for it, and then they edited some little clicking sounds in there, so that was really fun. So don't feel like you're limited by the dialogue as well. If there's like a sound that needs to be added, if they like the performance, then they'll get some either stock sound or they'll record something themselves to make it work. But don't be afraid to suggest ideas, even if the sound or the dialogue doesn't necessarily support it. Just, you can always pitch it. They'll either say yes or no. If they say no, just move on. But sometimes they like it, and then you get a bit more creative input.
So
You
Miguel,
got to. Sorry.
on that note, sorry, Aaron. Miguel asked if making these shots, are you able to choose the camera angle, or is that always given by the director? And because I guess that would help emphasize your performance as well.
For sure. I think in every case that I've been aware of, the camera's always been locked and set in stone beforehand. So they have storyboard artists come in and they have a previs process, and they've got their head of photography and cinematographers, and they've already established the cameras. And sometimes it doesn't always work, but 99% of the time it does. And so there has been cases where I've said to my animation director, I want to do this action. It might require a camera move. And then if they really like the performance, they can pitch it to head of photography, and then they'll say yes or no. But in most cases, I try to keep my staging and my performances inside the camera, because that's already been locked and established, and they have an intention behind that. So I don't want to change that. It's only if I feel like it really needs something that I would pitch it. And then part two of this subtext, going back to what we were saying with Hiccup, is, yes, you guys with me? And so he's trying to get their involvement. And so I thought that would be really fun that he's not just speaking to Hiccup, because it's a three-way conversation. Gobber is off camera. And so I thought it'd be really fun if he gestures to Astrid, and then when he says, oh, like when I'm at Toothless, he's looking over at Gobber, and that's when Astrid tries to calm him down. And so then she says, maybe more big picture, honey. So she's just like, don't get carried away. And so this was the moment where I wanted to kind of get the idea that Astrid's trying to tame him. Just like, don't, like, try not to get too overexcited and that kind of thing. So you kind of get where I'm going with subtext. I don't feel like I need to break down every single one of these, but you can always go back through the recordings if you want to read my subtext. But that's the main note I wanted to hit here, is like how I'm thinking about the tone of the shot and what they're thinking about as they say things. And that's going to determine the reference. So I'll go through now. So these are my thumbnails that I drew based on so because of this, because we were going for something more realistic here, what I actually did, it depends on the style of the show, but with this show, what I did was I filmed the reference first, and then I drew poses based on my reference and pushed them in ways that I felt suited the character's designs. And so I still got all the graphic shapes that I wanted, and I had my nice lines of action and that kind of thing, and all my gestures correct. But it was all based on the reference. That way it felt like I could pose it out and it'd feel natural. Whereas if I was doing something more cartoony, I would draw first, get some really nice shapes and really strong poses, and then I would film some reference that would help add maybe some little polish and like details on top. So I think, at least for me, it depends on the style you're working on. But yeah, in this case, I filmed first and then I drew over the top. So those are my thumbnails, and then this is the shot for reference. So this is the one that's massively edited. So there's a lot of different clips going on at once there, and I kind of just collaged it all together. But I mean, no one else is really going to see this when you're in the production. As long as they get the general tone right for the directors and they sign this off, then it's just up to you how you use it. But like all these, you can see in the reference here, like all these quivers in my hand. Like I did end up adding that, but I kind of had to reduce it because I felt a bit too scared, was one of the notes. Like they wanted him to be traumatized, but not like completely freaking out. And so there was like these little secondary quivers in there, but I used that as reference first. And again, like Catherine's performance is awesome here. Like I really like how she said, we may need to start from scratch. And she does this little like lean in and her head does this little like shake, and it just felt so natural. Like I just really like those beats, like the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It just worked really nicely. That's probably one of my favorite parts. So you can kind of see, there's a little thumbnail on the side where you can see the final shot. I'll show you it in full screen as well. But you can see kind of how I'm pushing the poses just a little bit, enough to get a line of action and still make the bodies feel connected, but enough that it just creates a bit of asymmetry and creates some nice shapes. So like in here, I followed my like mechanics quite closely, just like in the way my hips were moving, and like there's a bounce to my weight, and I'm like relatively similar builds to Hiccup, and so I didn't have to like, I felt like at least mechanically my body would work okay for Hiccup. I didn't have to get someone else to film for him. I did occasionally for acting choices, but I think most of the time I film myself, just because it felt natural, like in terms of physicality. Not always with acting performances, because I'm not an actor and I struggle with getting character sometimes, but I try my best. So there's this thing that Catherine did on the right screen right here, and you can see she does this little like hand flick. And that wasn't actually part of our rehearsal. She kind of just did it as a suggestion. She'd be like, it'd be really cool if he did this like thing with his hand. And she only did it one time, and I just thought that was really fun. Like I kind of did this thing where I swept my forehead, but the way she just flicked her hand to the side, it felt a little more like Hiccup. Because it's a bit more like scatty, and I thought that was quite fun. And so there, when you can see this pose of Catherine where she just got her hand just like, and I thought that was really fun. So I wanted to make sure I got that in the performance. And then when I went to the clicks, like I would use the timing on the clicks in my hands for the secondary action. And this bit was tricky because we did different takes, but essentially I wanted Astrid to like put her hands across his arm as he stretched and lower him down to be like, it's okay, you got to calm down now. And I had to kind of cut it because I was using different takes, because her performance in her face, in Catherine's face, felt better in one take, and my performance felt better in another. And so I had to kind of collage those to make it feel like they were still making contact, interacting. So there's a fair bit of like hacking things around. Yeah, I'll play the shot, final shot. So it feels a little more stitched together when I actually animated it. But there was a lot of like, okay, so this pose has got to go into this pose. So I had to kind of pick key frames from my reference and use those as key poses, which is why I drew my thumbnails. And then mostly I just used my thumbnails to pose, and I kind of forgot about the reference until polish. And then I would just look for any details that I had and then start to add that on top later. Cool. Go to the next shot. So here, this shot took so many times to refilm. It was the first shot I did on the production, and it was just Hiccup and Astrid running outside onto the front porch, and they saw Toothless in the sky. And it's the first time that Hiccup sees Toothless. So there wasn't this is one of those things. It's quite literal. It doesn't need subtext. It's literally Hiccup runs onto the porch and he's excited. It doesn't need more subtext. It's just that's what it is. And so I just animate to the context here in this case. The harder part was when I filmed the reference, I kept on showing it to my supervisor, and he would say, no, it doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel right. And I did this. I think I redid the reference each day and sent it to him in the next day. I did this 5 days. So there was about 6 or 7 different takes of different types of runs. And I kept on showing it to him, and he was like, it doesn't feel right. And then later, he sat down with me one day and he just goes, do you know what's wrong with your reference? And I said, no. And he said, you're not outside. Like, it's winter. It's freezing cold. That's why it doesn't feel like you're running like Hiccup would in this situation. And so I was like, actually, that's a very good point. Like, that would change his performance. He'd be a bit more uptight. Maybe he would, just be a little more stiff. And so we filmed the reference again, and me and Marta went outside for one of the other animators. And it was actually, even though it looks like it's a sunny day, it was actually quite cold outside. You see everyone else in jackets outside, and we were just in shirts and, a jumper. And so we just ran outside into the middle of Soho Street and filmed some reference, just pretending to look up at Toothless. And that was the final reference. And he was like, yeah, that just feels better now. But I still try to kind of make his arms a little frantic to make it feel a little bit like Toothless. Also, he has a peg leg. So I tried to make it feel like he was slightly, it's still made of metal, so it would support him. But I wanted to make it, and he had been using it for years, so I didn't want it to feel like he had a limp or anything like that. But I was just keeping in mind that there is a spring for his foot. So that might, the way he adds his weight to it, might not be as much pressure on one side. It's little things like that I was still trying to think about. Then I'll show you the final shot for that one, which was here. This one. It's such a short shot, and it took so many days to refilm it, but it paid off. Afterwards, it was my first time proper acting for something that's considered feature film quality, or at least we were trying to hit that mark as close as we could. And so I did want to make sure I was getting it right, and this was my first big eye-opener to okay, I need to fully get engrossed in the character. Where are they? Who are they? All these things, like I've mentioned earlier. Yeah, so that was the first time I had to do anything like this. Okay, we got some funny reference now. So I had a sequence with Hiccup in the robotic suit, and it's this massive, stiff, it's almost like a tin can, and it's made of really heavy steel. And it gets dropped. He's supposed to be on a tight wire, and it gets dropped, and it goes a bit out of control, and he doesn't know what he's doing. He can't see where he's going. And it starts spitting fire, and it's all going chaotic, and the whole stage goes up in flames, and it's this main climax of the film. And I couldn't put myself in a metal can. Of course, I was just like, okay, how am I going to film reference and make it feel heavy? Because I didn't want to just pretend that I knew what I was doing. I at least wanted to try and get some reference that was close. So I went back home to Cambridge, and I asked my dad if he had any cardboard boxes, and we found this massive cardboard box, and we punched holes out of it, and we just put me in this very stiff cardboard box, and I pretended to throw my weight around to make myself feel heavier. So I would try and step backwards almost to the point where I'd fall over, and then I would try and catch myself again. And I did it in different ways. So I tried to think of if it's in a robot suit, is it literally robotic? Because our director hadn't given us any direction at this moment. And so I was thinking, okay, is it going to be like a mechanical robot, like something out of Wallace and Gromit, or is it more like he's just Hiccup in a metal suit and he's just going to be like, oh, kind of thing? And they wanted it a little more natural. So they wanted, just imagine you're in a piece of metal and you're trying to balance. And so here's some very silly reference for you. So I wanted to show you the long take of this. So this is me trying different ways of walking. And then there was one near the very end. There you go. So they liked this piece of reference where I'm starting to lean and I just catch myself a little bit. And so you can kind of see in the shot there on screen left. It's just something that helped sell the weight. I wanted to show you this one mostly because people found it hilarious. There's just this shot of this random generic Viking woman and she screams as this flame goes above her head. And it won, we had like a little ceremony at the end of production where they gave us little awards for like best actor for certain characters, like best emotional moment. And I was really happy because this one won the funniest reference. And unfortunately, you don't see the woman run away out of shot. I did actually animate it so that she does this like little scamper away, but it didn't make it into the shot because the camera whips too far, too fast, too early. But I did animate it, but you can see it in the reference anyway. So it's just this little, I thought it'd be funny to do this little like kind of scamper away. Yeah, I wish it made it into the shot, but you don't see it in the end. You can just see it in the screen right there. The camera whips too fast.
Everyone loves your references, by the way, Aaron.
Thank you.
They're wondering how long it took you to animate from start to finish in a couple of these shots.
So I had about, I think on the very long one, so this one I had about a month, because most animators are given per month, it's around 20 seconds, and that can change in complexity, etc. If you have like one shot and it's 5 seconds, but it has 1,000 characters and they're all, I don't know, riding a dragon, then of course they're going to make that your one shot, so you get that right. If you've got some more simple shots where they're just kind of like subtle eye darts and not really moving, then you'd probably have more of them. So it varies in complexity, but for this shot, I had about a month. And it went through so many iterations. I think, if I remember right, I think the final version of this that was approved was like version 120 or something. It went through a lot of passes. It was mostly on mouth shapes and lip sync, which is what I wasn't very good at the time. And my supervisor gave me a lot of tips and lessons on that kind of thing, and I feel a lot more confident in my lip sync now. Also, some colleagues have helped with that. But yeah, it went through a lot of passes. For these two, I think it was about 3 weeks. Again, it was quite a struggle to lip sync with Gobber because his jaw is so far forward. Like, if I was going to the side, his front jaw his teeth are here, but his top teeth are like further back where mine are. And so he kind of talks with this massive hook. So it was hard to lip sync for like ooh shapes because you couldn't wrap his lips properly together because that's just not how his bone structure worked. There's little things like that, but a lot of things, like certain moments, took like a lot of different passes. The running one, so these two, I think I had about 2.5 weeks, 3 weeks. It was that was my first 2 shots in production, so we had a bit longer. Usually I shouldn't have got about 3 weeks for that, but it was my first time doing this kind of quality. And we were new to production and style and everything, and so they gave us a bit more time for those. Yeah, it varies on complexity, so it's hard to say. But with those shots, um, I'd say about 20 seconds for a month average. Got any more funny reference for you? So yeah, you can see here, if you look at the two screen right ones, the timing and everything is pretty similar. It's more just restaging, but I thought this one was quite good because you can see about this moment, I'm pretty much just about to fall over and my foot just about catches me. So I thought that was quite a good reference to make him feel like he was going off balance. This is probably one of my favorite shots to do. It was my first, well, not my first, but like my big moment using Toothless, and I really wanted to animate Toothless. And this is a very big moment because it was the first time that Hiccup's daughter was going to see Toothless in full shape and form for the first time. And they wanted her to be scared, like she had never seen a dragon before, but she realizes over the course of the next following shots that he's a harmless dragon. We wanted to get the impression that Toothless also recognizes that it's Hiccup's daughter. He's never seen her before in his life, but he looks at her and he sees Hiccup. And so you don't see that in my shot. They didn't want to reveal that too early. So in my shot, Toothless is still kind of confused and he's still trying to figure out who this person is. So he kind of approaches her slowly, just like, oh, there's a little child, like, who is this? And then over the next course of the shots, he's like, oh, it's Hiccup's daughter. And then he gets all emotional, like there's a little like sentimental moment. But in my shot, yeah, there wasn't too much subtext involved. It was more just her like trying not to move too much, and then him approaching her, just like, oh, who's this? And so I film myself on all fours like a dragon, just to help kind of sell the weight and get a timing. But then I also looked at a lot of reference from the dragon movies to make sure I was making sure he moved correctly, because Toothless walks like a bear, where his arms kind of fold inwards. So, like, trying to show you now, as the foot rolls off the ground, it kind of folds in and rolls under. And so it was those kinds of things in my reference that I was making sure. And also just the weight, because this is what I was saying in a previous talk with Eddie, is it's very hard to find the weight in a character that doesn't exist. So you've got to try and figure out how heavy is this character, and you've got to think about their bone structure, their mass, what kind of animals they're being based on, and also sorry, my brain went a bit blank, and also how strong they are. Sorry, there you go. I got it out eventually. So I'm trying to think about, like, because you could still be very heavy and very weak, and therefore you're not going to be able to push yourself off the ground too much, and that's going to change your weight and your timing. So I was but Toothless is very strong, so I didn't want it to make it feel like when he was walking it was too much of a struggle. I just wanted it to feel quite natural, but he needs to feel heavy as well. So yeah, that was this. And it was really fun to do. But it's just making sure that, like, as the foot comes down, there's a little bit of timing before it sinks down. And then there's like a nice cushion in as he settles. So it doesn't feel like he recovers too early, because then he'll feel too light. So it's just that little like kind of thing. And then I did this accent here in my reference, which we dialed right back. They didn't want him to feel too confused. They felt like it was an extra level too much. They just wanted it to be quite simple. And so that's where the directors kind of said, okay, do this action, but do it like 5 or 10% of what you've got there. So it was very, very subtle.
So are you presenting your references before you even present your Maya scene, your play bath? And then they say, okay, that looks good, start blocking?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of a procedure that we do with Dreamworks, where they want to see our performances beforehand. It's not like mandatory. We don't have to, but they encourage it. And most of us animators want to anyway. It's going to help us later. And so I'd say, yeah, 99% of the animators film reference, submit that first. Then the animation director will say this one, this one, this one. Or let's just do number 3 of these. And then we show that to the directors. They say, yep, that's good. And then we go into my scene. This one was quite a fun one, where after my supervisor was telling me about going outside and that kind of thing, getting into character, he said, think about Gobber, how heavy he is, what he's holding. In this case, he has in a massive costume. Like, he's actually dressing up as Stoic for this stage play. And so I thought it'd be fun to try and dress up as him as well. And this is where I was holding the book to try and help sell this like wooden plank prosthetic arm that Gobber had. So they wanted him to feel very like pantomime. So I deliberately made him like very deliberate gestures. I am strong. Because Gobber isn't an actor. They wanted it to be like kind of bad acting on purpose. So I thought this would be quite fun to just do some cliche stuff. And so I tried to think of like performances that would just be like, not completely literal, but occasionally sometimes it would be. So that was quite fun. Then this is a shot I did of Toothless, this is the first shot I did with Toothless actually, where he screams. It's a very short shot, but it was I think it's one of the only times in the short film where he gets angry, and so I really wanted to take liberty of that, and so I looked at a lot of reference of Toothless screaming and how he roars, how he like asserts dominance, and in context of this shot, the 3 little dragons, Toothless's baby dragons, flew away from home to go and find out who Hiccup was. And this is the first time that they've landed on the island and their parents have caught them. And the little kid's like, oh my God, we're in trouble. And this is Hiccup being like, why did you run away from home? And then, of course, Light Fury is there with them as well. And like we thankfully, we didn't have the actual film to watch as we pleased, but they did give us a few clips from the 3rd movie just as reference, and it was enough to get like personality out of Light Fury. And I got the impression she's quite she's very elegant and she's very sophisticated, but she's also kind of like, she's very confident in herself, and she looks down on people a little bit. She's a little bit judgmental, and she's a bit pompous kind of thing. Like she's very confident in her own self, I guess. It's hard to explain. But I wanted to get this impression that how would she tell off her children? And so I wanted that classic trope of I'm not angry at you, I'm disappointed kind of trope. And so there's classic brute force kind of Toothless, just like, why did you do this? And then Light Fury's just kind of like, you shouldn't have done this, children, kind of thing. And so this is the shot. I think I have it in sound. And so this is quite a fun one, because I really wanted to like exaggerate like the anticipation down with Toothless, and then as he screams, there's like this massive like dominant face where his jaw really opens wide. He was quite a struggle to animate, mostly because of his wings, because they're so wide, and I had to try and pose them so that they still felt like they would spread, but not like clipping through another character. So a lot of it is kind of posed to camera. But it worked in the end. I think the polishy part of that was like trying to make sure that as his body shook, that we still got some like secondary action, like overlap and follow through on the wings, but it didn't. They still needed to feel like bones. So that was quite a tricky one to get right. You can see there's a little bit of like ripple going down the spine. And then still trying to just like hit key poses, trying to keep like clean silhouettes. So I was trying to like make sure one side was slightly wider, one was slightly more straight. So this is like my simple line, and this was like slightly more complex. It's subtle, but like this side would be slightly more wide in volume, and this one is slightly thinner. He's quite flat to camera, so there was only so much I could push the asymmetry, but I tried my best. And then like pushing this thinner like neck that fed through her head kind of thing. Trying to keep it graphic still. I was trying to make it as 3/4 as I could, so that we still got a bit more like dimension to his body without like changing his eye direction too much. And so he only just about really looking at his son there. He's not even really looking at him, but I tried. I tried to push the 3/4 as much as I could, just because it helped. Like if when I tried to make him raw too much to camera, it just looked unappealing, and it just didn't read as much, like asserting his dominance. And so I tried to push that as much as I could, and then trying to get this like graphic shape of the silhouette of Slappy's wing. We had different names for him for the characters internally. Then I don't know what they actually called the night lights in the end, but when we was working on them, they didn't really have names. So internally, we made up our own like 7 Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs names for them. And so we called them Slappy, Sneaky, and Snoozy. I think that's what we called them. And those were like the common traits. It's actually quite funny because when people responded to the short film, everyone thought that Snoozy was high. They're just like, why is he high all the time? And we're just like, he's not high, he's tired. Like the whole time that was our trope that we was given by Dreamworks, is just to make him look like he's exhausted and he doesn't want to do anything. He's like lazy. But I saw some comments on YouTube like, why is he high? I thought that was quite funny. But yeah, then we had like Sneaky, who was the leader. She's a bit more mischievous and curious. And Slappy was like the boisterous one, and so there was 2 boys and a girl. And so Slappy and Snoozy would like play fight, and then she's like, boys, like classic boys and their toys kind of thing. Let's go on an adventure kind of thing. So that was our main objective from the studio, was to establish the 3 night lights and give them personality. That was the bit that we had like a bit more flexibility on. So that was fun. I think is that everything there. Oh, I've got one more shot I can show you from Dragons. And that was just some thumbnails. This I did last minute, and I was a bit more confident in my workflow and everything by this point. And so I think I was only given like 2 or 3 days to do this shot. And I just kind of had to bash it out because I was covering for someone who couldn't do it in time. I think they went away on holiday or something. They're like, can you do this? And I was like, oh, okay. And so, yeah, that was my thumbnails quickly. And then, yeah, that was the last shot I did for the movie. But I think that was the first time that I felt a bit more confident in my workflow. And so it was just like adding those accents where they felt natural. And then like his posture where he still kind of has his legs quite bent and he's a bit like he hunches over slightly. Like I felt like a bit more in character at that point. And also we'd had some classes from our supervisor, Sean Sexton, up at Dreamworks. And he'd come down to London and he'd given us loads of talks that he both teaches an animation mentor and also up at Dreamworks for their trainees, etc. In like lip sync and face polish and all those kinds of things, because none of us had really, well, not all of us, but some people had feature film experience on the production, but a lot of us hadn't. This being Jellyfish's first feature film quality as well. And so we had a lot of training from Sean, and he was really useful and very kind of us to give us all those classes and come down to London. But yeah, that was the first time I kind of used his face polish methods. And I was quite happy with the result. I would change things now, but you know, I was happy at the time. That's pretty much all the shots from dragons. And I've got one more I can show you. Oh, this is a funny one. No one would spot this, but us internally knew about it. So this is one shot I did of the night lights. It's a very short one. This is actually after Hiccup shouts at them. And there's just a little bit where they retaliate his roar. But the funny thing is, in the very background, I thought it'd be funny. There's this Viking, and he's on this podium, and he's shining the light on the stage, which is just part of the like scene. And because it was in the very background, I knew it'd be out of focus. I blocked it out, and I pitched it to the directors, and I like, he's a Viking. They're kind of like unhygienic and a bit like, I guess you could say, manly. You know what I mean? Where we're just, like a stereotypical trope of a man is that we're like, could pick our nose or something stupid like that. And so I thought it'd be funny if this Viking scratched his butt. And I blocked it out and I showed it to the directors, and they found it hilarious. And I was like, yeah, keep it. It's going to be out of focus anyway. So if you zoom in, if I frame by frame this, you can just about make out his arm scratching his butt. I thought that was quite funny that they kept that in there. I thought they would take it out, but you can just about see it. So sometimes if it's silly and it's very, like, you don't notice it, sometimes you get away with those things.